Common Sense and Nuclear Warfare by Bertrand. Read by the author. Chapter 4. Program of Steps Towards Peace. Those who realize the peril involved in the possibility of nuclear weapons have a very grave responsibility. The dangers are new, and the kind of thinking that they demand is also new. If mankind is to survive in the nuclear age, it can only be by the prevention of large-scale wars. This is a difficult end to achieve, and if it is to be achieved, in spite of the prejudices and mental habits of populations and politicians, it will have to be approached by stages and with comprehension of opposing points of view. The problem is not merely to discover measures which, if adopted, would prevent war, but to discover measures which, if, in addition to this merit, are also such as governments and public opinion, both in the East and in the West, can be induced to support. Measures which are to have both these merits must be such as to give no net advantage to either side and to secure to various nations involved in the preservation of those interests which they consider completely vital. In the approach towards a stable peace, there will have to be a number of stages, of which the earlier ones will be comparatively easy. The first step is to persuade the governments of East and West that their aims cannot be secured by a large-scale war. The second step is to persuade the governments of West and East that their opposite numbers are convinced in this obvious truth. It has been customary in recent years for each side to suspect the other of insincerity in negotiations, and it cannot be said that either side has been without grounds for this suspicion. If negotiations are to prove fruitful, there must not only, in fact, be sincerity on each side, but there must also, in belief, in sincerity of the other side. But there must also be belief in the sincerity of the other side. The word sincerity, however, demands some definition. It is not to be supposed that diplomats on either side will suddenly become indifferent to the interests of the powers that they represent. The kind of sincerity that is required is something different. It consists in the desire to reach agreement as opposed to the desire to find proposals which the other side will reject in spite of suffering propaganda disadvantage by doing so. If negotiations are sincere in the sense required, it will have to be acknowledged in advance that they must not be expected to involve any net loss to either party. If each side has genuinely abandoned war as an instrument of policy, it will be obvious that any agreements reached by negotiation must have the character of not altering the balance of power. This does not involve renunciation by either side of the belief that a change in the balance of power might be desirable. On this matter, each party may retain its beliefs, but it will have to alter the methods by which their success is to be furthered. The methods will have to be those that are adopted in the party politic of democratic countries. That is to say, there will have to be methods of peaceful persuasion and not of armed force. One step, which has already in part been taken, is the abandonment of neutral vituperation. The West thinks the Kremlin wicked, and the East thinks Wall Street wicked. Neither side in the past showed any reticence in the expression of these mutual detestations, and there is still room for considerable improvement. But if negotiations are to be fruitful, a certain degree of mutual courtesy is indispensable. Apart from this consideration, belief in the wickedness of possible enemies is apt to become exaggerated and melodramatic. It would be well to remember that men are not merely political and that outside the political sphere, there is little important difference between East and West as regards purely human hopes and fears and joys and sufferings. The propaganda machine on both sides should turn from promoting hate to promoting awareness of common humanity. This, I repeat, is already being achieved in some measure, but in nothing like the degree that is to be desired. The first matter upon which we may hope for governmental agreement is the abolition of nuclear tests. This is within the sphere of immediate practical politics. Although it is only a first step, it is capable of having considerable importance. In the first place, it puts an end, for the time being, to the diffusion of man-made poisons which must have already caused an unknown amount of cancer and genetic damage and will cause more and more of such damage as long as the tests continue. Much more important than this consideration is the fact that a general agreement to suspend tests will prevent the spread of nuclear weapons to powers which at present do not possess them. This spread is imminent, and if it takes place, it will very greatly increase the danger of nuclear war. There is another reason for welcoming an agreement to abandon tests, namely, that any agreement between East and West about anything is to the good. The long wrangles that have disgraced disarmament conferences have brought the friends of peace to the verge of despair, and it will be a source of hope if it is proved that on this point agreement is possible. I think the next step should be a solemn joint declaration by the United States and the USSR to the effect that they will seek to settle their differences otherwise than by war or the threat of war, and that, to implement this declaration, they should appoint a permanent joint body to seek measures tending towards peace and not altering the existing balance of power. I am not suggesting that a body should be entrusted with decisive power, at any rate until its procedures had been tested in practice. What I am suggesting is that it should be invited to study every dispute that might arise and to suggest such settlement as each side might be willing to accept. I do not think that definitive conclusions could be quickly reached, since any global agreement would be favorable to one side in some parts of the world and to the other in other parts, so that it would have to be treated as an indivisible whole and not divided into separate matters. The questions that have to be decided are of two sorts. Though the two cannot be rigidly separated, there are questions of disarmament and there are territorial questions. As to the latter, it should be agreed that during negotiations the status quo should be maintained, but as to the former, something more immediate is necessary. What gives urgency to disarmament questions is the very real risk of unintended war. The doctrine of instant retaliation, proclaimed by the West and presumably adopted also by the East, is one which exposes the world to an appalling risk not sufficiently acknowledged by the statesmen or sufficiently realized by the public. Each side proclaims that it will never make an unprovoked nuclear attack, but it does not feel certain that the other side will show equal virtue. It is known that some accident may be misinterpreted as a nuclear attack, and that retaliation may occur before the mistake is discovered. The danger will be very much increased if many powers have nuclear weapons. An attack by one of the minor powers would almost certainly be thought to be an attack by one of the major powers, and would, therefore, precipitate a major war within an hour or two. It is of the utmost urgency that means should be found of averting such dangers. No measures of conciliation can give any degree of security while each side remains in readiness to repel any supposed attack by instant full-scale retaliation.